Lord Kelvin, William Thompson, known as Lord Kelvin, one of the great scientists of history, he says, until we can measure a thing, we really know very little about it. Well, you believe the Bible, how sure are you? Can you measure your confidence? Yes, you can. The Old Testament was translated into Greek in 270 BC. It's a matter of record. You can check any competent encyclopedia. They'll confirm. Under Ptolemy Philadelphus, he funded the 70 scholars to get the best scholars they could find to translate the Hebrew scriptures. That's a matter of history. The point is, the Old Testament contains over 300 prophecies detailing the Messiah, the coming Messiah. That's a bunch. And what I thought we'd do tonight is go over each one of those. All right, no, I won't do that. Let's just talk about the ones that are quoted in the Gospels. There are a lot of them that go beyond the Bible, but he was supposed to be of David's family. He was born to be born of a virgin. He would be born in Bethlehem. He would sojourn in Egypt. He would live in Galilee, in fact, in Nazareth. He would be announced by an Elijah-like herald that would occasion the massacre of Bethlehem's children. He would proclaim a jubilee to the world. His mission would include the Gentiles. That's in Isaiah 42 and elsewhere. His ministry would be one of healing. He would teach through parables. He would be disbelieved, then rejected by the rulers. That's all laid out in the Old Testament. Did you know that? Remarkable, isn't it? Let's just take the last week of his ministry. He would make a triumphal entry into Jerusalem. He would be betrayed by a friend for 30 pieces of silver. He would be like a smitten shepherd. He would be given vinegar and gall. They would cast lots for his garments. His side would be pierced. Not a bone would be broken. He would die among malefactors. His dying words were foretold. The first and last quotes are in the Old Testament. He would be buried by a rich man. He would rise from the dead on the third day. That's all through there, by the way. And the resurrection would be followed by the destruction of Jerusalem. That's all in the Old Testament. Okay? So I'm not going to take all 300. I'm going to select 8 of them. And I'm going to select what probably are 8 of the simplest ones to deal with for a little exercise that I think you'll find provocative. The first one is very familiar to you, and that's, we see it on the Christmas cards every day, Micah 5:2. That was the reference that Herod's scribes brought forth when the Magi inquired, where is he that's to be born King of the Jews? Micah says, but thou, Bethlehem Ephrathah, though thou be little among the thousands of Judah, yet out of thee shall he come forth unto me that is to be ruler in Israel, whose goings forth have been from old, from everlasting. This verse is so full of insights we could spend a whole week on it. But we're going to just extract the one obvious step, and that it tells where the birthplace of the Messiah would be. He's going to be born in Bethlehem. The question I want to pose is, what's the probability of any person that's lived in the last couple of thousand years, taken at random, of fulfilling this? Well, that's like asking, what's the probability of somebody at random being born in Bethlehem, right? How many of you know someone born in Bethlehem? Can I see a show of hands? Come on, people. How many of you know someone born in Bethlehem? Gotcha. Gotcha. Okay, besides him. All right. Well, the population of Bethlehem is about 7,000 people. So we'll just round it off up to make it easy arithmetic. We'll call it something less than 10,000. And at any one time throughout the world, let's assume over the last few thousand years, there's something less than 1 billion people over the period there. So the probability of someone being born in Bethlehem is about 10 to the 4th divided by 10 to the 9th, or 1 in 10 to the 5th, or putting it another way, 1 chance in 100,000. If you have you'd have to have an audience, a random audience of over 10,000 to have a probability of having somebody, hey, I was born in Bethlehem. Okay? That's all we're saying. It's probably less than that. We're trying to be conservative here because it's actually smaller than, anyway. Let's take the next one. It's out of Zechariah 9:9, probably also familiar to you. Zechariah says, rejoice greatly, O daughter of Zion, shout, O daughter of Jerusalem, behold, thy king cometh to thee. He is just and having salvation, lowly, and riding upon an ass, and upon a colt, the foal of an ass. This is the prediction in Zechariah that the Messiah would present himself as riding a donkey, entering Jerusalem, that event that we later celebrate on what we call the triumphal entry, right? Okay. How many have presented themselves as a king to Jerusalem riding a donkey? Even General Gordon, when he entered, he got off his horse and he walked in. He wouldn't presume. Well, what's the probability of someone doing that? Well, I don't know that there were any, but if I say there's less than 1 in 100, am I being generous? For sure, okay. For our purposes, that'll do. Let's go to the number 3. This is in Zechariah 11, and it's pretty straightforward. He says, I said to them, if you think good, give me my price, and if not, forbear. So they weighed for my price 30 pieces of silver. What does 30 pieces of silver echo in your mind? The betrayal of? Okay, good. How many people, the last few thousand years, have been betrayed for 30 pieces of silver? I don't know of any. Let's assume there were some. If I say less than 1 in 1,000, am I being generous? I think so. I could say 1 in probably 10 million. It'd be still right, but I'll say 1 in 1,000. Let's keep it simple. This next one is sort of related, but I'm treating it separately. Zechariah 11:13, a couple of verses later, he said, the Lord said unto me, cast it unto the potter, a goodly price that I was prized out of them. And I took the 30 pieces of silver and cast them to the potter in the house of the Lord. So Zechariah, for some reasons led by the Lord, is acting out a prophecy here. So I took the 30 pieces of silver and cast them to the potter in the house of the Lord. Now you won't follow this unless you've been reading your gospel very carefully. Let's take a look at what really happened. Then Judas, which had betrayed him, when he saw that he was condemned, repented himself and brought again the 30 pieces of silver to the chief priests and elders, saying, I have sinned in that I have betrayed innocent blood. I find that remark very interesting because if Satan has indwelt Judas, then it's Satan declaring Christ's innocence, which I think is kind of interesting. But anyway, he says, I betrayed innocent blood. What did the chief priests say to him? What is that to us? See out of that. In the Hebrew, it's tough luck, old buddy. No, anyway, that's the idea. Okay. So he cast down the 30 pieces of silver in the temple and departed and went and hanged himself. The story's not over yet. The chief priest took the silver pieces and said it's not lawful to put them into the treasury because it is the price of blood. See, it was prohibited. They could not take the price of blood, put it in the treasury. It was prohibited. But the chief priests had good accountants on staff. Okay? And so they took counsel and bought with them the potter's field to bury strangers in. See, the temple had a burden. When someone died in its precincts that had no next of kin, the temple had to deal with the burial. That was a cost. Every year there's maybe 1 or 2, some number, and it was something they had to deal with. They couldn't put the money in the treasury because that's illegal, but they could prepay expenses with it. Okay? You buy a year's worth of gas or something. Well, they bought a field that they had a need for when strangers die, that the temple had to deal with. So they took counsel, bought with them the potter's field to bury strangers in. Wherefore that field is called the field of blood to this day. But notice the key factors here. The price was 30 pieces of silver. The location of the transaction was where? In the temple, the house of the Lord. Who ends up with the money? The potter. That's all embodied in Zechariah 11:13. What's the probability of that randomly? Probably 1 in 10 billion. I don't know, but I'm going to say 1 in 100,000. I'm being to get the intersection of that. It's pretty remote. This is a very special one to me, and I'll explain why in a minute. Number 5. One shall say unto him, what are these wounds in thine hands? And then he shall answer, those with which I was wounded in the house of my friends. When I was in my teens for a while, I got on a kick of doing Bible memory work. And whenever I found an interesting verse, I would type the verse on a little 2x3 cards. I'd type it on one side and put the reference on the other, and I'd carry some of these with me to try to, to learn them. And which is another reason I'm glad I stayed with the King James. One reason I like the King James today is because I know it'll be around 20 years from now. The new ones will be eclipsed by better new ones, fine. But I'm glad, Bible memory is one of the things that I'm glad I didn't invest all my energy in some, I won't pick one to talk about, but one that is no longer the vogue one. You follow me? King James is safe. It's got problems, but they're well known. So, okay. But as I started to memorize this thing, I kept stumbling. I caught it, wounds in hands. Oh, wow, there's a prophecy. And I typed it up and added it to my little collection. And I'd start trying to memorize it. And one shall say to him, what are these wounds in the hands? Then he shall answer, those with which I was wounded in the house of my friends. The more I thought about that, I could not visualize a group of Roman soldiers driving spikes through his wrists as being in the house of his friends. And I get to John 20, verse 25. The week before, well, actually the night, on the resurrection evening, that morning he raised from the dead, he goes with the Emmaus disciples to Emmaus, then that night they all gather, and while they're all together, Christ appears in the midst of them. Thomas was not with them. You can imagine what the next day was like. Hey, buddy, you should have been at this Bible study last night. Guess who showed up? And Thomas said to them, except I see in his hands the print of his nails, put my finger into the print of the nails, and thrust my hand into his side, I will not believe. That's where he gets the label Doubting Thomas here, right? Okay. Well, 8 days later, again with his disciples, they were inside a room, and Thomas was with them. Then came Jesus, the doors being shut, and stood in the midst and said, peace be unto you. Then said he to Thomas, reach hither thy finger, and behold my hands, and reach hither thy hand, and thrust it in my side. Be not faithless, but believing. Can you imagine Thomas being shook? First of all, here the Lord supernaturally shows up, okay? And then it's obvious that he heard what he said a week before. Ouch, ooh. Thomas answered and said to him, my Lord and my God. I visualize him falling on his knees with that one. Jesus said to him, Thomas, because thou hast seen me, thou hast believed. Blessed are they that have not seen and yet have believed. Now when I go back to Zechariah 13:6, what are these wounds on hands? Those with which I was wounded in the house of my friends. What wounded Christ was not the nails. It was Thomas's unbelief. Well, anyway, how many people taken at random have been wounded in their hands in the house of their friends? I'll say 1 in 1,000, and I'm being generous. Fair enough? Number 6. Isaiah, you have to take one or a couple from Isaiah 53. He was oppressed and he was afflicted, yet he opened not his mouth. He is brought as a lamb to the slaughter, and as a sheep before her shearers is dumb, so he opened not his mouth. Ooh. How many prisoners accused of a capital crime, in other words, death penalty, make no defense even though innocent? There may have been some. There may have been some that were innocent and didn't choose to defend themselves. Don't know how many. I say less than 1 in 1,000. Is that fair enough? I think so. Okay, one more here. A couple more, I guess. It says he made his grave with the wicked and with the rich in his death, because he had done no violence, neither was any deceit in his mouth. How many people died among the wicked and yet were buried with the rich that were not attorneys? I'm sorry, I had to. No, all kidding aside, how many died among the wicked and yet buried with the rich? There's an implicit contradiction there. I'm going to say less than 1 in 1,000. I think I'm being generous. Last one, just to wrap it up. For dogs have compassed me, the assembly of the wicked have enclosed me, they pierced my hands and my feet. That's a very strange death to be described in the Psalms, because the official form of execution in Israel was stoning, not crucifixion. This was written 700 years before crucifixion was invented. It was invented by the Persians and widely adopted subsequently by the Romans. How many people, taken at random, have died by having hands and feet pierced? Well, tens of thousands, I'm sure. But if I say 1 in 10,000 in the population of the world, I think I'm being generous. You with me so far? Okay, let's tie it together. See, where are we going here? Born in Bethlehem, king on a donkey, 30 pieces of silver, temple potter and all that business, wounds in the hands, no defense though innocent, died with the wicked, grave with the rich, and crucified. Okay, we've got 8 prophecies here. Now, the next thing we're facing here requires a little tutoring. I'm interested in the combination. What's the chance of a particular person fulfilling all of these? We have the probability of each individual one. What's the composite probability of all of them? Well, how do we go about that? Let me give you a little tutoring here. If I had a population here of 100 people, say, and let's assume that 60% of you are male and 40% are female, if I have someone blindfolded and they reach out and tap someone on the shoulder, what's the probability that they picked a female? Well, what you do, you take the total population. I've got 60% male, 40% female. Obviously, the probability of touching a female shoulder, so to speak, is 0.4, 40% or 0.4. You with me so far? Okay, let's assume I have a population of 60% right-handed people and 40% left-handed. And for these discussions, let's assume that they're uniformly distributed. What is the probability that someone selected at random is left-handed? Well, same thing, 40%, right? Okay, here's the point I'm trying to get to. What's the probability of those same circumstances of selecting a left-handed female? Well, I take the one distribution of left-handedness, and I take the other distribution of masculine or feminine, and I put those two together and take the one that's in common. Follow me? So the chances of getting a left-handed female would be 0.4 times 0.4, or that turns out to be 0.16. In other words, what I do is I multiply those probabilities to get the composite one. Follow me so far? Okay. Now you can figure out why I use powers of 10 all the way through here, because the easy way of multiplying powers of 10 is just count the zeros. And if you count all those zeros, you'll discover there's 28 of them. So the probability of a single person involved here is the product of those 8, which turns out to be 10 with 28 zeros after it. You with me so far? I'm not quite through, because what we've got to do, we want to divide that by the total population we're dealing with. I'm going to assume in the last few thousand years, if I have 100 billion, that's more than enough. And we probably had congressmen there not checking anyhow. Anyway, so I take the 1028 and divide it by 10 to the 11th. The way you do that is simply subtract the exponent. So I've got 10 to the 17th here. Now, if I was in a statistics class and I was going to try to convey to you what I mean by 1 chance in 100, the typical way to get that idea across is to get a bucket, get, say, 100 silver dollars, put it in the bucket, take one of them and put some nail polish on it or something, put it in the bucket, so I've got one that's marked of the 100, and I shake it all up and create a situation where I have an equal chance of getting any one of them. I reach down there and I pull out. My chance of picking out the one I marked is 1 chance in 100. You were following me? That's a way we get across this concept, what we mean by probability. It's 1 chance in 100. Okay, my difficulty here is I've got to get across to you what we mean by 1 chance in 10 to the 17th. 10 to the 17th turns out to be a very, very big number. So what I need to do is get a bucket and put 10 to the 17th silver dollars in it, right? Okay, it turns out, how do I do that? Well, I take the state of Texas and I fill it 2 foot deep with silver dollars. It turns out if you go through the arithmetic, that's about 10 to the 17th silver dollars. So I mark one of them with some lipstick or whatever, and I take Gary, blindfold him, and put him on a tour in such a way that he has an equal chance of being exposed to any one of those. He reaches down there with his blindfold and picks out his chance of picking the one we marked is 1 chance in 10 to the 17th. You with me so far? Okay. It's pretty remote, right? 2 feet deep. Wow. Okay. Well, I want to do this again. We took 8 prophecies before. I'm not going to take you through another 8. In fact, if I picked any other 8, they're going to be more specific, that is more rare, than the ones we picked. I'm going to ignore that. I'm going to assume that the next 8 have a distribution no different than the first ones. They're actually going to be much more specific, but let's not complicate it. So I got over 300 to choose from. The next 8 would probably be more specific, that is less likely than the previous ones, but I'm going to ignore that. I'm going to assume no decrease in likelihoods. I now have 10 to the 28 times 10 to the 28, right? So that's 10 to the 56th. I've got to divide that by the 10th to the 11th of all the people lived. So that means I now have a problem of communicating to you 1 chance in 10 to the 45th. That is a really big number, okay? So I need to create a bucket with 10 to the 45th silver dollars in it. How big is that bucket? It's more than the state of Texas. In fact, I need to take an astronomical unit that's defined as the distance between the Earth and the Sun. Okay? I need to make a ball of silver dollars, but to make one with 10 to the 45th silver dollars, I need to have a ball that's 30 times the distance, the radius is 30 times the distance of the Earth to the Sun. Now we get Gary with a spacesuit on. We mark one of those. We mix them up so they could be anywhere. And we send him out there. And his chance of reaching out and picking one at random is 1 chance in 45th. You with me so far? One more time. I want to do this one more time. I'm not going to double it this time. I'll triple it. We went from 8 to 16. Now we're going to go from 16 to 48, just to pick a number. And so, remember, I want 48. I got 300 of these things to pick from. And I'm going to assume no decrease in likelihoods. Actually, it'd be much more precise, but I'm ignoring that aspect, okay? So it's 10 times 28, 6 times. So I got 10 to the 168th, but I got to divide by the 10 to the 11th all the people. So now I have a problem of trying to create an imaginary concept here to get across how rare is 1 part in 10 with 157 zeros after it. Well, silver dollars won't work on this. They're too big. So I'm going to indulge in imagining what is probably the smallest thing you can imagine. It's called an atom. Okay? Now, I'm going to make a ball, a collection, of every atom in the universe. Turns out there's a widely accepted estimate that there's about 10 to the 66th atoms in our galaxy. Okay? Okay. But I'm only 10 to the 66th. I've got to find a way to get to 10 to the 157th. Okay. I will make such an imaginary ball for each atom in the universe. So I got 10 to the 66th. I'm up to 10 to the 132nd. Ooh. I'm still a long way from 10 to the 157th. So I've got to do this silly imaginary thing every second since the universe began, assuming it was about 15 billion years ago. That turns out to be 10 to the 17th seconds. So I multiply 10 to the 132 by 10 to the 17th. I'm now at 10 to the 149th. I'm still not at 10 to the 157th. I'm still short by 100 billion times. So that's as large a concept as you and I can get our minds around. Let me say it another way. And by the way, we only dealt with 48 of the 300. Do you see where I'm headed here? I am more certain that Jesus is the Messiah of Israel than I am of any other fact in my existence, including my own name. Because there's nothing else I can think of that I know by that certainty. All this was extracted, of course, from hour 13 of Learn the Bible in 24 hours. And if you want to get in this again. And by the way, in doing this, I haven't chosen the most amazing of the prophecies. His detailed genealogy is staggering to lay out. The specific prediction of the exact day that the Messiah would present himself as king to Jerusalem. The prophet Gabriel told Daniel 500 years earlier the exact day that Jesus would present himself as a king riding that donkey in Jerusalem. Staggering in itself. Just that one thing is such an absolute demonstration that Jesus is exactly who he claimed to be. The Old Testament Midrashic prophecies, it goes on and on and on. The 69 weeks. The commandment to restore and build Jerusalem unto the Messiah the king, Gabriel says. And by the way, all of this was translated into Greek 3 centuries before the fact. So it's in black and white, whoever wrote it. And what Gabriel says to Daniel is there's 173,000 days from that commandment, which was yet to happen, to the Messiah. We know that decree was decree of Artaxerxes Longimanus of March 14th to 445 BC. The only time he allowed himself to be presented as king was the triumphal entry on April 6, 32 AD. And these can all be verified. Sir Robert Anderson was knighted. He did his study and published it in 1894. And head of Scotland Yard, interestingly enough. But anyway, if you go through the arithmetic, you'll discover that Gabriel's margin for error was 0. The exact day that he predicted was the exact day that it happened. And that is staggering in its implications, and you can verify this by any diligent study. See, the epistemological approach, epistemology is study of knowledge, its scope and its limits, its origin, its scope, and its limits. That's what epistemology means. And we first of all establish the integrity of the design of these 66 books. Great. Once you discover that it's a design, you quickly discover they present a person in history, the Messiah. He establishes identity from before and during and subsequently. And he then, once you realize who he is, the creator, the guy that created the universe, allowed himself to become a man and enter his creation to fulfill a destiny that we could not fulfill for ourselves. And he then also, along the way, authenticates the whole package. That to close the loop. That's bulletproof. You need to understand it, be able to do it yourself. The return of Christ to rule. Almost 2,000 references in the Old Testament, 17 books give promise to the event, 318 references in the New Testament. It's emphasized everywhere. For every prophecy of Christ's first coming, there are about 7 or 8 of his second coming. They're going to happen with the same precision that the first ones did. I've got a challenge for you before you leave. We'll wrap it up. I'm putting on something on the screen that I hope you challenge. If you accept what I put on the screen, you flunked the course. I believe it, but that's not the point. I believe you and I are being plunged into a period of time about which the Bible says more than it does about any other period of time in history, including the time that Jesus walked the shores of Galilee or climbed the mountains of Judea. That's a preposterous statement. But to challenge that, you've got to do 2 things. You've got to find out what the Bible says, not what Chuck Missler says or anybody else. It's too important. Find out for yourself what the Bible actually says. The second thing you've got to do is you've got to find out what's really going on. And you won't on the 10 o'clock news. Now, in today's world, you can, but it takes some diligence to find out what's really happening, not to swallow the lies and the deceit that comes out of our government and the media, and on it goes. You've got to do some homework.